The signal came without warning. I was in the middle of a budget review when every screen in the building went white. Not the soft white of a system error. A hard, clean, absolute white, like someone had poured light into every pixel at once. Then the sound came. It was not a sound that belonged to anything I had heard before. It was low and layered, like 3 different tones played at once, each one pressing against the inside of my skull. The translators in the building's main console took 11 seconds to catch up. 11 seconds of that sound. I counted. When the words finally appeared on screen, they were calm. That was the worst part. Not threatening, not dramatic, just calm. The way a landlord is calm when he hands you an eviction notice. Attention, third planetary body, Sol system. You are hereby summoned to appear before the Galactic Council at Station Verth 9. Classification and registration proceedings will commence in 30 galactic cycles. Attendance is mandatory. Non-compliance will result in quarantine designation. That was it. No greeting. No name for us. Just third planetary body. 8 billion people on this planet, and we were a rock with a number. My name is Yael Dresch. I am 34 years old. I was, until that morning, a junior officer in Earth's Diplomatic Research Division, a department so quiet and so overlooked that most people in the building forgot we existed. We did archival work, treaty analysis, historical pattern matching between old Earth negotiations. It was not glamorous, but I was good at it. I read things carefully. I noticed details that other people skipped over because they were too small or too technical to seem important. That skill was about to become the most important thing about me. Within 6 hours of the signal, the orbital sensors confirmed what the message had implied. 17 vessels had taken up positions around the solar system. Not inside it, around it. They sat at the edge like a fence, evenly spaced, each one roughly the size of a small moon. They were not pointing weapons at us. They did not need to. Their presence was the message. We were inside a circle that someone else had drawn. The emergency session of the World Security Council opened at 3 o'clock in the morning, GMT. I was not supposed to be there. I was there because my director, a careful and brilliant woman named Louise Hartley, had called me 20 minutes before and said, "Yael, get dressed and get in a car. I need someone who reads the fine print." The chamber was full of people who looked like they had not slept in years, even though the crisis was only hours old. Generals and ministers sat around the circular table with their aides standing behind them, all of them speaking over each other in low, urgent voices. Screens on every wall showed the 17 vessels from different angles. Someone had given them a name already. The press outside was calling them the Fence. I stood near the back wall and read the full text of the transmission on my tablet. Not the summary that was being discussed at the table, the full text, every word. It was 47 paragraphs long. Most people in that room had only read the first 2. The rest of it was what I would later describe, in my official report, as the most arrogant piece of bureaucratic writing in the history of communication. The council laid out its structure, its authority, its history, and its rules in dense, procedural language that was clearly not written to be understood by anyone being spoken to. It was written to be used against them. But buried in paragraph 31, tucked between a clause about communication protocols and a subsection on biological classification standards, was a sentence that made me stop breathing for a moment. Any species subject to formal proceedings retains the right, under Article 7 of the Galactic Charter of Sovereign Engagement, to submit a written rebuttal and to request a full assembly hearing before any binding classification is enacted. I read it 3 times. Then I walked to the front of the room. I am not a general. I am not a minister. I am a junior analyst with a tablet and a habit of reading footnotes. The room did not go quiet when I walked forward. I had to speak loudly enough to interrupt 2 separate conversations before Louise caught the eye of the council chair, and he raised his hand for silence. "Who are you?" the chair asked. "Yael Dresch, sir, Diplomatic Research Division. This is a security briefing, not a research review." "Yes, sir, but they sent us a legal document, and I think we need to treat it like one." I held up my tablet. There is a clause in their own transmission that gives us the right to a formal hearing before they can do anything to us. We can send them a response, not a surrender, not a refusal. A legal reply. We request the hearing. The room was quiet for a moment. One of the generals leaned forward. His name was Franklin Ade, a large and serious man who had spent 30 years preparing for threats he had always imagined would come from other nations. And if they ignore it? He asked. Then they are violating their own charter, I said. And we have that in writing. There was a long pause. Outside, the night sky over Geneva was clear, and if anyone had looked up, they might have seen the faint, steady lights of the fence, sitting at the edges of the solar system, patient and cold. Louise looked at me across the room. She had the expression she always wore when she was thinking fast. Then she gave me a small nod. Draft the response, the chair said quietly. I went back to my tablet and began to write. It took me 4 hours. I checked every word against the clauses in the original transmission. I made sure the language matched the Council's own format so precisely that there would be no technical grounds to dismiss it. I cited Article 7 in full. I used their punctuation style. I even matched the paragraph numbering system they had used. When it was done, Louise read it once, made 2 small corrections, and sent it up the chain. Earth's response went out at 7:23 in the morning. It was 4 sentences long in our language, and considerably longer in the Council's translation format. It said, in essence, we have received your summons. We note our right to a formal rebuttal hearing under Article 7 of the Galactic Charter of Sovereign Engagement. We will attend. We also have questions. We did not bow. We did not beg. We did not threaten. We sent an RSVP. The response from the Council came back in 40 minutes. It was a single line, a confirmation of the hearing date, and a set of coordinates for travel instructions. They had not expected us to read the whole document. That was their first mistake. It would not be their last. I sat back in my chair in that Geneva briefing room as the sun came up over the lake, and I thought about the word they had used for us. Third planetary body. Not Earth, not humanity, not even a species name, a location. I thought about all the things we had ever been called by people who did not understand us. I thought about every time in history that someone had handed humanity a document designed to confuse us into giving something away, and how sometimes it worked, and how sometimes someone read the whole thing. I thought about what was waiting for us at Station Verth 9. Then I opened a new document and started preparing for the hearing. The shuttle they sent for us was not designed for human comfort. I figured that out within the first 10 minutes. The seats were shaped for beings with a different center of gravity. The air had a faintly sweet chemical smell that gave me a mild headache, and the lighting was set at a spectrum that made everything look slightly wrong, the way a photograph looks when the color balance is off. I adjusted my seat cushion for the 4th time and gave up on comfort as a goal. There were 6 of us in the delegation. Louise Hartley, my director, who had insisted on coming herself despite 3 separate attempts by the Security Council to send someone with more political rank. Rank means nothing to a species that doesn't know we exist, she had said, and no one had a good answer for that. Dr. Ren Okoro, our lead historical analyst, a quiet man in his 50s, who had spent his career studying the patterns of how powerful institutions maintained their power. Lieutenant Commander Priya Nair from the Space Corps, who was there as our technical advisor, and who I suspected was also there to quietly assess the structural vulnerabilities of everything we passed. My colleague Owen Marsh, who was the best living expert on nonverbal communication across human cultures, and who had spent the last 3 weeks consuming every piece of data we had on non-human behavioral signals, and myself. The 6th person was a man named Carl Birch. He was from the Council's own translation office, a human who had been recruited 12 years ago through a channel that none of us had known existed until 48 hours before departure. Carl was 41, thin, and very careful with his words. He told us on the first day that the Council had been aware of Earth for longer than their transmission had implied, and that the word they had used for humanity in their internal documents was not pre-rational. It was a word that translated more accurately as ungovernable. He said it without any pride or shame, just as a fact. I found that far more interesting than anything they had called us officially. The journey to Verth 9 took 9 days. We were not given access to the ship's navigational systems or any view of our route. The windows could be covered, And after the first day they were. I spent most of the time in the delegation's shared workspace, reading. Louise had given me access to everything our division had ever archived on interstellar law, theoretical frameworks for multi-species governance, and historical case studies of contact scenarios that Earth's academics had written over the past century, mostly as fiction, some as serious academic work. I read it all. On the fourth day, Carl sat down across from me and watched me read for a while. "You're looking for something specific," he said. "I'm looking for patterns," I said. "What kind?" "The kind that show how an institution maintains control when the controlled party doesn't know the rules." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a species in the council," he said. "The Kreth. They've been registered for over 400 years. They sit in the chamber. They vote. But there's a weight system. Their votes count for 0.3 of a full vote. Because of their classification tier, they've never been reclassified." I looked up from my tablet. "Why not?" "Because reclassification requires a petition to the council, reviewed by a committee of the council, approved by a quorum of the council." He paused. "You see the structure?" I saw it very clearly. On the sixth day, Priya pulled me aside in the narrow corridor outside the workspace. She had that particular stillness she got when she was being very precise about something. "The vessels that are keeping station around our solar system," she said quietly, "they're not military." "What do you mean?" "Their configuration, the spacing, the sensor arrays, they're not warships, they're signal stations. They're broadcasting something into our solar system." "What are they broadcasting?" "Carl says it's a registration frequency. It marks a region of space as under council jurisdiction." She paused. "We've been inside their broadcast range for about 60 years. I thought about that for a long moment. 60 years. I thought about all the signals we had been sending out into space for 60 years. All the television broadcasts and radio waves and satellite communications. And I thought about how all of that had been traveling through a region of space that something had already quietly claimed. "Do they need our consent to broadcast that signal?" I asked. I asked Carl. He said it's in the procedural code. Uninhabited regions can be claimed by broadcast alone. Inhabited regions require a formal registration agreement. And we never signed a registration agreement. We didn't know there was one to sign. I went back to my workspace and read for another 3 hours. Then I found it. It was in the Galactic Charter, Section 44, Subparagraph 9. A region of space could only be designated under council jurisdiction if its primary inhabited body had either signed a registration agreement or had been formally classified through an uncontested proceedings hearing. Uncontested. If we contested it, the proceedings were not complete. If the proceedings were not complete, the designation was not valid. If the designation was not valid, 60 years of broadcast signals had no legal standing. I wrote it all down very carefully. Then I went to find Louise. She read my notes twice. Then she sat very still for a moment, the way she did when something important was settling into place in her mind. "They brought us here," she said slowly, "to complete the proceedings." "Yes," I said. "And if we refuse to be classified, the proceedings stay open." "Yes. And if the proceedings stay open, the designation is invalid. By their own charter." "Yes." Louise looked at me across the small table in the dim workspace of an alien ship, 9 days from Earth, surrounded by stars we could not see. "Yael," she said, "we need to be very careful, and we need to be very precise, because if we are right, this is not just about us." She meant the other species. The ones who had been classified before they understood what they were agreeing to. The ones who had been inside the system for centuries. The ones who had been given 0.3 votes and told to be grateful. I thought of something Carl had said on the first day, so casually that I had almost missed it. He had said, "The council doesn't worry much about the species it's already registered. It's the unregistered ones that cause complications." I was beginning to understand why. Verth 9 came into view on the 9th day. They uncovered the windows for the approach, and for a long moment all 6 of us just looked. It was enormous. That word felt completely inadequate, but there was no better one in any language I knew. The station was not shaped like anything that Earth engineering would produce. It had no visible symmetry. It grew outward in layers and curves and structures that seemed to follow their own internal logic, like something that had been built by many different minds over many different centuries without anyone ever stopping to ask if it all made sense from the outside. Which, I supposed, was exactly what had happened. Carl told us quietly that Verth 9 had been under continuous construction for approximately 4,000 years. Priya said nothing, but I saw her eyes moving across every surface, reading it the way she read everything. The docking bay we were directed to was near the outer edge of the station, in a section that Carl explained was designated for pre-classification visitors. The bay was functional and clean, and completely empty except for us. No welcoming committee, no ceremony. A single automated platform directed us through a corridor to a waiting area. The waiting area had chairs. They were not designed for humans. I looked at them for a moment, then found a section of floor with good sight lines, and sat down on it. Louise sat beside me. Owen started quietly cataloging every architectural detail he could see. Ren opened his research kit and began making notes. Priya stood near the entrance and watched the corridor. I read my notes one more time. The hearing was scheduled for the following morning, in the council's time system. Carl explained that the chamber held delegates from over 900 registered species, that each species had an assigned position in the chamber, determined by their classification tier, that Earth would be positioned in the observation section, a gallery above and behind the main floor, without a formal delegate seat, because we had not yet been classified. Where do the Kreth sit? I asked. Carl pointed to a location on the chamber schematic on his tablet. It was near the back of the main floor, not the observation gallery, but far from the central floor where the senior council members sat. And the council's senior members, I said. How many species are represented there? 7, Carl said. Out of 900. Yes. I looked at the schematic for a long moment. 900 species in one chamber. 7 of them making the decisions. The others watching, voting with their 0.3 votes and their classification tier weights, and their 400 years of registration. Carl, I said, when was the last time a species contested its classification? He thought about it. Officially? Never. There have been withdrawals from proceedings. 2 species that simply refused to appear. Both were quarantined. But no formal contest. No one used Article 7, not that I know of. I nodded slowly. The waiting area was quiet, far above us, through walls of material I could not name. 900 species went about the business of a galaxy they believed they understood completely. I thought about what it meant to walk into a room where everyone assumed they already knew how the conversation would end. Then I thought about 31 years of reading footnotes. I closed my tablet, set it on my knee, and decided to get some rest. Tomorrow, I was going to ask the Galactic Council a question that no one had ever asked them before. I was going to ask them to show their work. The data chip arrived before the hearing began. I was standing in the corridor outside the main chamber, reviewing my notes one final time, when a small figure stepped close beside me. The Kreth delegate was about 4 feet tall, with gray-green skin and large amber eyes that moved independently, the way a lizard's eyes do. He wore the standard delegate badge of the council, a flat silver disc with colored indicators I could not read. He did not look at me. He moved past me as if he were simply walking by. Something pressed against the back of my hand. When I looked down, I was holding a small, flat chip, no larger than my thumbnail, made of a dark material that was warm to the touch. I closed my fingers around it. I did not look for him in the corridor. I kept my eyes on my notes. But I thought about what Carl had told me on the ship. 400 years of 0.3 votes. I thought about what it means to wait that long for someone to read the whole document. The chamber was exactly as large as I had imagined, and nothing like I had pictured. The scale was the first thing. It was not designed for any single species. It was designed to hold all of them at once, which meant that some sections had high ceilings and some had low ones. Some had bright lighting and some were kept dim. Some sections had standing platforms and some had seating arrangements that made no sense to human eyes. 900 delegations, each in a space calibrated to their biology, all arranged in a vast ring around a central floor where the council's senior members sat. The central floor was elevated slightly. 7 seats, 7 species, all of them older than most Earth civilizations. We were placed in the observation gallery. It was clean and well lit, and had nothing in it except a long bench and a translation console. Owen immediately identified it as the section used for species that the Council did not intend to hear from. The gallery had no floor microphone. The translation feed ran one way. You could hear everything. You could say nothing. Except that Louise had asked, and Carl had confirmed, that Article 7 hearings required a floor microphone to be active for the petitioning party. It was in the procedural code. The microphone had to be activated before the session opened. If it was not, the session was technically out of order. Priya had found the microphone housing in the observation gallery during our walk through the previous evening. She had said nothing about it then. Now, as the session was called to order by the Grand Arbiter, a tall being with a pale, layered face, and a voice that came in waves rather than syllables, she quietly reached under the bench and activated the connection manually. The translation console blinked twice. We had a voice, the Grand Arbiter, whose designation Carl translated as Thesivore Prime, opened by welcoming the assembled delegations in a tone that suggested welcoming was a formal necessity rather than a genuine sentiment. Then, without transition, he began reading Earth's file. It was not flattering. The charges, if you could call them that, were listed in 3 categories. First, unauthorized faster-than-light research. We had been conducting theoretical work in that area for decades, apparently in violation of a council regulation that prohibited pre-classified species from developing certain technologies. We had not known about this regulation. We had not been told it existed. This was not mentioned as a mitigating factor. Second, failure to respond to 12 prior contact attempts. I wrote this down carefully. 12 contacts. I had never seen any record of them. Neither had Carl. Neither had anyone in Earth's government. When I wrote a small note to Louise asking if she had any knowledge of them, she shook her head. Third, and most interesting, what Thesivore Prime called cultural volatility. The file described humanity as a species prone to internal conflict, resistant to hierarchical authority, and historically unreliable as a treaty partner based on our interactions with each other. They had been watching us for 200 years, apparently, and this was their conclusion. I kept writing. When the recitation was finished, Thesivore Prime looked toward the observation gallery with the particular expression of someone performing a courtesy they do not believe is necessary. The Sol delegation may now observe proceedings, he said. Classification assessment will be conducted by committee and returned within 6 cycles. He had not invited us to speak. He had said, observe. Louise leaned to the microphone. Grand Arbiter, she said clearly. Earth formally invokes Article 7 of the Galactic Charter of Sovereign Engagement. We are here for a rebuttal hearing, not an observation session. We request the floor. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. Thesivore Prime looked at the observation gallery for a long moment. Then he looked at the console in front of him. He was checking, I realized, whether the microphone in our gallery was supposed to be active, whether it had been authorized. It had been activated, not authorized. Those were different things under procedural code. Carl had explained this to us carefully. An activated microphone in an Article 7 session was protected. It could not be deactivated without closing the session entirely, and closing a session midway through a formal Article 7 invocation was itself a charter violation. Carl watched all of this from his seat beside me, with the expression of a man who had known for 9 days that this moment was coming, and had spent that time deciding which side of it he wanted to be on. Article 7 invocation is noted, Thesivore Prime said at last. His voice had not changed. That impressed me, in a way. The Sol delegation will be allotted standard rebuttal time. Thank you, Louise said. We will need somewhat more than standard time. We have a number of specific legal questions. She handed the floor to me. I stood up at the gallery railing and looked out at 900 delegations in the largest room I had ever stood in, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not calm exactly. Something more useful than calm. Clarity. Grand Arbiter, I said. Members of the Council. Fellow delegates. I paused on that last word intentionally, making the inclusion deliberate. My name is Yael Dresch. I am a diplomatic research officer for the government of Earth. Under Article 7, I would like to begin our formal rebuttal by asking the Council to provide the complete public record of every species classification proceeding conducted in the last 500 years. A sound moved through the chamber. Not a word. Just a sound. The way air moves through a large space when many different beings shift at once. Thesivor Prime was very still. That record, he said carefully, is an administrative archive. It is not standard hearing material. Article 7, Subclause 4, I said, reading from my tablet, states that any petitioning species may request documentation relevant to understanding the proceedings they are subject to. Classification records of other species are directly relevant to understanding the standards by which Earth would be classified. We are entitled to review them. Another silence, this one longer. I had been thinking about what it feels like to be in a room full of people who have already decided what you are. I had been thinking about it for 9 days on a ship with covered windows. I thought about it now, standing in a gallery above 900 delegates, looking down at 7 seats in the center of the room. And I thought that the most important thing you can do in a room like that is ask a question that the room cannot answer, without showing you something it would rather keep hidden. Thesivor Prime conferred with the 6 beings beside him for approximately 2 minutes. The chamber was very quiet during those 2 minutes. I did not sit down. The request is noted, he said at last. Archive access will be granted to the Sol delegation for relevant documentation. Thank you, I said. We also have some questions about the 12 prior contact attempts that were mentioned in our file. We would like dates, transmission records, and confirmation of delivery for each one. I looked at my tablet. When you are ready. Beside me, I felt Owen exhale slowly. In my peripheral vision, I could see Priya with the faintest expression of something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. The hearing had been scheduled for 4 hours. We were going to need more than that. The archive access came through at midnight, station time. Ren was already awake when the console chimed. He had not been asleep. He had been sitting at the workspace table with 3 tablets arranged in front of him and a cup of something warm that Carl had found in the station's supply system, something that tasted faintly of ginger and was close enough to tea to be comforting. When the data began arriving, he looked at it for a long moment before calling for the rest of us. By the time I sat down, he had already organized the incoming files by date. How far back does it go? I asked. All the way, he said. They gave us everything. I think they expected us not to understand it. The files were in the Council's standard administrative format, dense and cross-referenced in ways designed for their own systems. But Carl had spent 12 years working with those systems, and he pulled his chair up beside Ren and began converting the format, while I handled the sorting and Louise handled the pattern analysis. Owen cataloged the behavioral markers in the preceding transcripts. Priya built a timeline on the wall screen, plotting each classification by date, species, and outcome tier. We worked through the night. By the early hours of the following morning, we had a picture. It was not a complicated picture once you could see it. That was the remarkable thing. The Council had not been subtle. They had not needed to be, because no one had ever sat down with their complete archive and read it all the way through. In 500 years of recorded classification proceedings, 412 species had been formally registered. Of those, 397 had been classified in the lower tiers, Tier 3 and below, which meant 0.3 votes, which meant that their petitions for reclassification went to a committee composed entirely of Tier 1 and Tier 2 species, all of whom had a structural interest in maintaining the tier system exactly as it was. None of the 397 had ever been reclassified upward. Ren pointed to a particular pattern that appeared in the economic data attached to each registration agreement. Every Tier 3 or below species had, as part of their classification agreement, granted the Council administrative rights over their primary interstellar travel lanes. Not ownership, administrative rights. The difference was important legally, but in practical terms it meant that every ship traveling to or from a lower-tier species home system passed through a checkpoint managed by the Council, who charged transit fees that went into a fund administered by and distributed to Tier 1 and Tier 2 species. It's a toll road, Owen said. It's the whole highway system, Ren said quietly. The 12th file in my stack was the one I had been both looking for and dreading. The Vorin. Their preceding record was listed under the category of Classification Withdrawn, Voluntary Cessation. I opened it and read it carefully, twice. Carl read it over my shoulder. The Vorin had appeared at their classification hearing 480 years ago. They had asked questions. Not the same questions I had asked, but the same kind. They had raised concerns about the tier system. They had asked for the complete archive, though they had used different language for the request. The Council had denied the request on procedural grounds that no longer appeared in the current charter. The proceeding had been suspended rather than completed. The Vorin's home system was listed in the current administrative record as uninhabited, no registration status. That last part was a lie. Not a mistake, not an oversight. A deliberate entry in an administrative record, made at a time when the Vorin were still very much present in their home system, and kept in place for the 480 years since. Carl read the file and said nothing for a very long time. Louise asked him what he was thinking. "I've worked for them for 12 years, he said. I knew the structure was old. I knew it favored certain species. I told myself it was complicated, that there were reasons." He looked at the screen. "This isn't complicated." "No," Louise said. "It isn't." I closed the Vorin file and opened my legal analysis document. I had been building it since before we left Earth, adding to it on the ship, refining it during the hearing. Now, I added 3 new sections based on the archive. The first section addressed the 12 contact attempts. The archive included transmission logs. None of them included delivery confirmation. 2 of them had been sent on frequencies that Earth's technology could not receive at the time they were sent. 1 had been directed at the wrong planet. I documented each one carefully. The second section addressed the jurisdictional claim, the 60-year broadcast signal, the registration requirement, the fact that no valid registration agreement existed, the fact that, under the Council's own charter, an incomplete proceeding could not support a valid jurisdiction claim. I cited the relevant sections. I footnoted everything. The third section was the one that took me the longest to write, because I wanted it to be exactly right. It addressed the Vorin. It said, plainly and in careful legal language, that the administrative record for the Vorin home system contained a material inaccuracy that affected the validity of related jurisdictional claims in that region of space, and that the continued maintenance of that inaccuracy in an official council record constituted a violation of the documentation standards required under the Galactic Charter's own integrity provisions. I did not use a more loaded word than inaccuracy. I did not need to. The documentation spoke for itself. When the section was finished, I read the whole document from the beginning. It was 41 pages. I read every page. Then, I sent it to Louise. She read it in 20 minutes. She made 4 small edits, all of them improvements. Then she looked at me across the table in the dim workspace of our temporary quarters on Verth 9, with the station's recycled air humming around us, and 900 species sleeping in their own sections of this enormous structure. And she said something I have thought about many times since. "Yael," she said, "when we go back into that chamber, we are not just speaking for Earth." I knew that. I had known it since the data chip had pressed against my hand in the corridor. I had known it since Carl had told us about the 0.3 votes. I had known it since I read the word uncontested in the charter, and understood what it would mean to contest it. "I know," I said. "Are you ready?" I thought about what it means to be ready for something that cannot be undone. Once we stood up and said these things in the full assembly, with the microphone active and the translation feeds running to 900 delegation consoles, it could not be unsaid. It would be in the record. The Council's own record, which they had just granted us access to, which meant our access and our findings were already part of the preceding archive. You cannot put something back in the dark once it has been read aloud in a room full of people who finally understand what they have been looking at. "Yes," I said. Louise nodded. She turned off the light above the workspace. Outside our window, the station lights of Verth 9 burned in patterns I was slowly learning to read. I did not sleep that night either. But it was a different kind of wakefulness, not the anxious kind, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you are going to do next, and knowing exactly why. The full assembly session opened at the first hour of the station day, which the Council's system called the commencement bell, a sound broadcast through every corridor and section of Verth 9 that was apparently traditional and deeply important, and to my ears, sounded like a very large building clearing its throat. I was already in my seat. I had been there for 40 minutes. I had my tablet, my document, and a glass of water that Carl had brought, along with a quiet word of something that was not quite encouragement. He had said, simply, "It matters that you are here." I had thought about those 5 words for the rest of the walk to the chamber. The assembly was larger than the previous session. The gallery section where we sat was now joined by a number of additional delegates who had clearly requested observer status since the first day's proceedings. Carl counted quietly and told me there were representatives from 14 species who had not been present before. Some of them he recognized, others he did not. Below us, on the main floor, the 900 registered delegations filled their sections. The 7 senior council members took their central seats. Thesivor Prime opened the session with the standard formalities. Then he looked at the observation gallery. The Sol delegation has submitted a written document under Article 7 procedures. The document will now be entered into the record, and the Sol delegation will be given the floor for their formal rebuttal presentation. This was proper. This was exactly what the charter required. He could not have done otherwise, and the fact that he announced it in the same measured tone as everything else told me only that he was very good at not showing what he was thinking. I stood up. I spoke for 2 hours. I did not raise my voice. I did not use dramatic language. I read from my document, and when I departed from it, it was only to explain a point more clearly, to give context, to make sure that the translation feeds were rendering a concept accurately. Carl had helped me identify 3 places where direct translation might lose important meaning, and I had prepared alternative phrasings for each. The 12 contact attempts came first. I went through each one. Dates, frequencies, targeting coordinates, delivery records. For each of the 12, I showed why it had not constituted a valid attempt under the Council's own communication standards. The chamber was very quiet while I did this. I imagine it is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room when a very confident institution hears its own record read back to it and realizes it does not look the way it felt at the time. The jurisdictional analysis came next. I built it piece by piece, the way Ren had taught me to build any historical argument, from the foundation up, so that each piece supported the next, and none of it could be pulled away without bringing the rest with it. The broadcast signal, the registration requirement, the incomplete proceedings, the charter provisions. I cited every section by number. I did not editorialize. The structure spoke for itself. By the time I reached the tier system, I noticed something happening in the chamber. Delegates were talking to each other, not during my presentation, but in the brief pauses between sections, when I stopped to drink water or check a reference. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the movement of communication was there, subtle and continuous, like a current running beneath the surface of the room. The Kreth section was still. Their amber eyes, every one of them that I could see, were directed at the gallery. I reached the section on the economic structure, the transit fees, the tier weights, the pattern that 500 years of classification had built without ever stating itself plainly in a single document. I described it as clearly and neutrally as I could. I described it the way you describe the layout of a building. Here is this room. Here is this corridor. Here is what you find when you follow it all the way to the end. I did not say that it was wrong. I did not need to. When I reached the Vorin section, the chamber was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. I described what the archive showed. Their appearance at proceedings 480 years ago. Their questions. The suspension of their case. The administrative entry, listing their system as uninhabited. I read the entry aloud. I let it sit in the air of the chamber for a moment. Then I said, calmly, under the documentation integrity provisions of Article 19 of the Galactic Charter, this entry constitutes a material inaccuracy in an official council record. We are formally requesting that it be corrected. Thesivor Prime had not moved in a long time. I looked at the 7 central seats and then deliberately looked away from them, out at the rest of the chamber, because this was the part that mattered most. Fellow delegates, I said. I used the word again. I had planned to use it here. Earth did not come to this chamber to fight the Galactic Council. We came because we received a document that required a response, and we read it carefully, and we found something that required us to ask questions. That is what we have done. These are the questions. The record is now complete. I paused. Earth will not be registering under the current framework. We are not refusing cooperation with the wider community of species represented in this chamber. We are declining a specific agreement that, on review, we cannot enter in good faith. Our reasoning is in the document. Our door is open to any species that wishes to discuss a different framework, one built on what we were told this council was created for. I picked up my tablet. I believe the phrase in the original charter is mutual sovereign dignity. I sat down. The silence held for a long time. Then something happened that Carl later told me was extremely unusual in the history of council proceedings. A delegate stood up. Not from the central floor, from the main section of the chamber, the Creth section. The delegate rose from their seat, which in their cultural register was, Carl whispered to me, the closest expression they had to standing applause, a physical declaration of acknowledgement. A second delegate rose, from a section I did not recognize. A third. Thesivor Prime said something. I do not know what it was, because the translation feed had a 2-second delay, and by the time his words reached my console I was watching a fourth delegate rise, and a fifth. And what I remember most clearly is not any single moment but the overall shape of it, the way a room changes when people in it realize they are allowed to move. Owen put his hand on my arm. I looked at him. His expression was the careful, precise expression he wore when he was reading something nonverbal very accurately and wanted to make sure he was reporting it correctly. That's not agreement, he said quietly. It's recognition. They're recognizing the act, not the outcome. I know, I said. Louise leaned over. Time to leave. We stood up. Carl gathered the equipment. Priya was already at the door. Before I turned to go, I did one more thing. I reached to the translation console and left the communication channel open, wide open, broadcasting Earth's contact frequency on the Council's own network, which meant it was accessible to every delegation in the room. Then I walked out. The corridor outside was long and quiet, and my footsteps echoed in a way that made the space feel larger than it was. The others walked with me, and no one said anything until we had rounded a corner and the chamber doors were behind us. Louise spoke first. Well, she said. Well, Priya agreed. Ren was already making notes. Carl walked beside me for a moment and then said quietly, so that only I could hear, there is something I should tell you. About the Voron system. I looked at him. Their file says uninhabited, but the file was entered 480 years ago, and no one has sent a survey mission since, because the file says uninhabited. He paused. Someone should probably check. I thought about that for a long moment, walking through the corridor of Verth 9 with the station's recycled air around me, and a return journey of 9 days ahead and 8 billion people at the end of it who were going to want a full briefing. Someone will, I said. 6 months later, I was sitting at my desk in the Diplomatic Research Division in Geneva when the first message arrived from the Creth. It was formal and careful, and written in a style that suggested someone had drafted it several times. It said that the Creth sovereignty was interested in discussing the framework that Earth had referenced in the assembly chamber. The phrase, mutual sovereign dignity. They wanted to know what we meant by it. I started writing a reply. By the time I finished the first draft, 4 more messages had arrived. 3 from species I did not recognize, whose names I had to look up in the archive. 1 from a species whose file I did find, because they were listed in the Council's records under a different name, the name the Council had given them rather than the one they called themselves. They had been registered for 230 years. They had 0.3 votes. The sanction motion against Earth came on the 11th day after the hearing. The Council filed it formally, citing our refusal to complete classification proceedings and our disruption of standard session order. It required a quorum vote of all registered delegations. The vote was taken. We watched the results come in through Carl's connections. It failed. Not by a large margin, but it failed. Enough delegations abstained that the quorum was not reached. The motion lapsed under procedural rules, automatically, without further action required. Carl called to tell us. His voice was quiet, and he chose his words carefully, the way he always did, but I could hear something underneath them that had not been there before. What will you do now? He asked. Keep reading, I said. He laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, as if he had not expected to find laughter close to hand just at that moment. Louise knocked on my office doorframe in the afternoon. She had a tablet in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, and the expression she wore when things were moving faster than even she had planned for. "Survey team wants to go to the Voron system," she said. "They need authorization." "Give it to them," I said. She nodded. "There's something else." She set the tablet on my desk. On the screen was a message. The translation stamp at the top showed it had come through one of the deep space relay systems that Earth had been quietly building for the past 3 years. The message was short. It had taken 3 weeks to arrive. It said, "We knew you'd come." I read it twice. Then I looked out my window at the Geneva sky, which was a pale winter blue, clean and cold and very clear. Somewhere above it, far beyond where the eye could reach, signals were moving. Some of them were new. Some of them had been traveling for 480 years. I thought about what it means to wait, to keep a small colony alive on a moon, without technology, without contact, because something happened 4 centuries ago that told you the people who should know the truth would not come looking unless someone made them look, and to wait anyway, to keep the light on in the darkness and believe that eventually, someone would read the whole document. Priya came by in the evening with a data summary of all the incoming contact signals. She had organized them by species, by region, and by what she called intent classification, her own system for reading the subtext of diplomatic language. Most of them she categorized as cautious interest. 3 she marked as something more urgent, species currently under active registration enforcement who were asking, very carefully, whether there was a legal mechanism they could use. There was. I had already found it. It was in Article 7. They just needed someone to explain that they were allowed to use it. Owen stopped by last. He had been doing what he always did, reading the non-verbal record of everything, going back over the archive transcripts, watching the chamber footage from every angle available, cataloging the behavioral signals of hundreds of species in the moment after I sat down. He had a theory, which he shared with me in the careful way he always shared theories, as an observation rather than a conclusion. "The species that stood up," he said, "in the chamber. I've been looking at the ones who didn't, the ones who stayed seated. And? Most of them wanted to stand. You can see it in the physical micro-movements, the lean, the small shift of posture. They started and stopped." He paused. "They were afraid." "Of the council?" "Of being first." He looked at me. "You made it easier for the ones after the first. But someone still had to be first." I thought about the Kreth delegate in the corridor. The data chip pressed against my hand. 400 years of waiting for someone to read the whole document. "They've been practicing being first for a long time," I said. Owen nodded. "Yes, I think that's right." After he left, I sat alone in my office for a while. The division was quiet. The building was quiet. Outside, Geneva went about its evening in the ordinary way that cities do. Lights coming on in windows, people moving through streets, the small continuous business of being alive. I thought about what the council had called our greatest flaw: emotional volatility, stubbornness, resistance to hierarchical authority, the tendency to keep asking questions even when the room had clearly decided the conversation was over, the tendency to read past the summary and into the footnotes, the tendency to notice the one delegate out of 900 who pressed a chip into your hand and understand what it meant. They had meant it as a list of problems. I decided to keep all of it. I opened a new document on my screen and began writing. Not a legal filing, not a briefing. The beginning of something else. A framework, built from scratch, in plain language, with no tier system and no weighted votes and no administrative rights over anyone's travel lanes. A framework that started from the phrase the original council charter had used, and then spent 500 years walking away from. Mutual sovereign dignity. It was a good phrase. It deserved a better document. I had a lot of reading to do. I had a lot of writing to do. I had messages to answer and survey teams to authorize, and species to speak with who had been waiting, some of them for a very long time, for a conversation that someone had kept postponing. Outside, the stars were coming out over Geneva, the same stars that had looked down on this planet for all of human history, through all the times we had been small and frightened and wrong, and all the times we had been stubborn enough to keep reading until we found the part that mattered. I turned back to the screen. There was work to do.